So the ARP 2600, one of the most famous synthesizers of all time, turns 50 this year. And when the first versions were released in 1971, they very quickly captured the imagination of composers, producers, performers, educationalists, and sound designers. And 5 decades later, it still inspires all of those people, to the point that you could go out today and buy a number of software or hardware replicas of the 2600. And that's no small feat when you consider that the rate that technology moves for something to remain relevant in basically the same layout for 5 decades probably says more than words can about how much of a genius design this was and is. So as you can see, I've borrowed an original 2600, thank you CALC, and this is a 2602, which is the European badging of the 2601 version 2, which was the penultimate model in that original 10-year production run, dates it from about 77 to 80, something like that. What's significant about this unit, as well as the gorgeous orange, black and white livery that just looks so tasty, is the filter, which was a revised design because the earlier one, it transpired, infringed on Bob Moog's ladder filter design. So they revised it and they actually made a calculation error when designing this so that it's missing the top end, which gives it a darker, heavier kind of sound, which I really like. Other people don't. We can discuss filters ad nauseum, and I'm sure we will. But I'm going to crack on and make some sounds with the 2600 to show you a bit about what this instrument can do. So most of us would think of the 2600 as a monosynth, which is essentially what it is, but that doesn't mean that you can't get polyphony from it. The later 2600s have a duophonic analog keyboard that utilised a trick to isolate a high and low voltage, which allows you to play 2 different pitches at once. This was something that ARP had a patent for and was standard on the Odyssey from inception. With 2 oscillators tuned at an interval tracking the lower voltage and a 3rd oscillator tracking the higher, I can get 3 notes from 2 keys on the keyboard. The outcome is paraphonic as they all share 1 filter and 1 amp, so it's a little bit clunky, but it's far more than you'll get from most monosynths. So something that I'm going to use a lot is this section to the far left of the 2600 that has a preamp, envelope follower and ring modulator. I'm running a drum machine into the envelope follower so that I can derive an envelope from its signal. I'm then using that envelope to modulate the filter cutoff. I've also got the drum machine audio signal running into the ring modulator with oscillator 1, and I'm then jamming some notes on the keyboard using the portamento, octave switches and vibrato.
The aim was to give something of an idea as to why the 2600 had a resurgence with electronic musicians in the 90s, about a decade or so after ARP had shut down, because it really lends itself to groove-based music and grubby sounds. So no prizes for guessing the reference here. I'm using the 2600 kind of in the way Pete Townsend did in the early 70s. I've blasted my guitar through the preamp with the gain and gain multipliers maxed out for some fuzzy distortion. I've then got a combination of modulation from the clock sample and hold on the filter, oscillator 2 for tremolo on the VCA, and the envelope follower, which is lagged and inverted on one side so that you get differences in the stereo image. There is a distinct left and right. And whilst this sound is easy to do with pedals nowadays, that whole industry was really in its infancy in the early 70s, and so I can imagine how cool it must have been to be able to process your guitar this way for the first time back then. So some unashamedly electronic sounds there, demonstrating drums and tune percussion. And what's interesting to me is how very basic synthesis was later used in the first gaming computers people had in their homes. So we associate these kinds of sounds with that, but it of course all came first with analog synths. Last but not least, how can you have a 2600 in your studio and not do the R2-D2 thing? As I'm sure you all know, Ben Burt used a 2600 for R2's voice, and he achieved this by running his own voice into the preamp and by using the envelope follower for modulation. Combining his voice with the electronics of the 2600 gave R2-D2 a human quality that helped the audience relate to him rather than view him as just a robot.
So there we go, a few sounds I made with the 2600. There are hundreds of sounds you can make with the 2600, but obviously that would be a very long video. Now, I've had the great privilege and pleasure of using some original 2600s, and I've also interviewed people who invented the 2600, worked on its production and its marketing in my documentary, Electromotive, The Story of ARP Instruments. Now, in that documentary, we introduced the Alan R. Perlman Foundation, who were in their infancy at the time, and now feels like an appropriate moment to give you an update on that.
So, the foundation has a board and has qualified and received 501c3 status, which means they are officially recognised as a not-for-profit and therefore tax exempt, which is fantastic. They have a space at the Record Co in Boston, and they've managed through discounted purchases and donations to build up a collection of vintage ARP synthesizers and Korg reissues. Now, this means they can start running programs such as ARPs for all, so that people who would otherwise be unable to access them will be able to, and there will be hands-on use, learning and experimentation. Huge thank you to anyone who has donated. You can now begin to see the fruits of that. They still need funding ongoing to support their work, running costs, to expand their programs to meet their ambitions, and to restore some very old instruments that they've managed to acquire. I will donate any ad revenue from this video and I'll double it with my own money as a starter, but if anyone else wishes to throw them $5, $10 or whatever you can spare as a 2600 birthday present, that would be greatly received. The links are in the description and the pinned comment.
Huge thank you to you for watching. Thank you to CALC for lending me his wonderful instrument, and I hope I'm as cool as this guy when I'm 50.